Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the tulip bulb you bought yesterday for the price of a mansion is now worthless. Completely worthless. You can't even give it away. Your life savings, your family's future, your children's inheritance, all gone because of a flower. This nightmare became reality for thousands of Dutch citizens in February 1637, when the world witnessed its first economic bubble burst. This is a story of Tulip Mania, the moment when an entire nation gambled everything on colorful petals and lost. And here's the terrifying part. The same patterns that destroyed the Dutch economy in 1637 keep repeating throughout history, from the dot-com crash to the housing crisis to cryptocurrency booms. The Netherlands, in the 1630s, was unlike anywhere else on Earth. The Dutch Golden Age was at its peak, and Amsterdam had become the beating heart of global commerce, the financial capital of the known world. Dutch ships dominated the seas, their massive East India Company fleets sailing to the far corners of the planet, bringing back exotic goods that Europeans had never imagined. Spices that could preserve food and cure ailments. Porcelain so delicate it seemed magical. Silks that shimmered like liquid gold. The Dutch were getting rich, incredibly rich, and they were looking for new ways to display their wealth. Into this world of prosperity arrived the tulip, a flower that would change everything. These flowers had originated in Central Asia and had been cultivated by the Ottoman Turks for centuries. When Ogier Gezellin de Busbecq, the Austrian ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, first saw tulips in Constantinople in the 1550s, he was mesmerized. He sent seeds back to Europe, where they eventually reached the Netherlands through the botanist Carolus Clusius, who planted them in the gardens of Leiden University in 1593. Clusius was obsessed with keeping his tulips exclusive, rarely selling bulbs and preventing others from accessing his prized collection. But human nature being what it is, thieves broke into his garden and stole bulbs, spreading them throughout the Dutch Republic. This theft, this act of botanical larceny, would set in motion one of history's most bizarre economic events. These weren't ordinary flowers. Tulips were alien, extraordinary, unlike anything that grew naturally in European soil. Their vibrant colors, ranging from deep purples to brilliant reds to pure whites, captivated everyone who saw them. But more than their beauty, tulips represented something that the newly wealthy Dutch craved desperately: status. In a society where traditional nobility was giving way to merchant wealth, where your bank account mattered more than your bloodline, you needed new ways to show that you had arrived. Tulips became those symbols, living declarations of wealth and sophistication. The wealthy merchants of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Haarlem began cultivating elaborate tulip gardens. They competed with each other fiercely, trying to grow the rarest and most beautiful varieties. Tulip gardens became tourist attractions that drew visitors from across Europe. People would travel for days just to see these magnificent displays during the brief blooming season. The flowers bloomed for only a week or two each spring, making them even more precious and exclusive. You had to time your visit perfectly or miss the spectacle entirely for another year. But tulips had a fundamental problem that would ultimately fuel the mania to unprecedented heights. They were incredibly difficult to cultivate, requiring patience that most people didn't possess. A tulip grown from seed took 7 to 12 years to flower. 7 to 12 years of careful cultivation, of protecting the bulb through harsh winters, of hoping that disease or pests wouldn't destroy your investment. And even after all that time and effort, you had no idea what color or pattern the flower would display until it finally bloomed. It was botanical gambling, a lottery that took over a decade to resolve. The only way to speed up the process was through bulb offsets. A mature tulip bulb would occasionally produce smaller offset bulbs that could be separated and grown independently. These offsets would flower in just a year or two instead of a decade, making them far more desirable. But each mother bulb only produced a few offsets per year, making propagation painfully slow. Rare varieties remained rare because you simply couldn't produce them quickly enough to meet the growing demand. This scarcity would become the foundation of the entire speculative market. Then nature intervened in the most unexpected way, transforming the tulip trade forever. A virus, which we now know as the tulip-breaking virus, spread through Dutch tulip gardens. This virus was carried by aphids and infected bulb after bulb throughout the Netherlands. But instead of destroying the flowers, as most plant diseases do, it created something that seemed miraculous at the time. The virus caused the tulip petals to display stunning striped, flamed, and feathered patterns that looked impossible. Solid-colored tulips transformed into living art, with intricate designs that looked hand-painted by divine artists. These broken tulips, as they were called, were absolutely breathtaking to behold. The most famous varieties had names that evoked their beauty and rarity: Semper Augustus, with its red flames on a pure white background; Viceroy, with its purple and white stripes that seemed to dance in the light; Admiral van der Eyck, with its intricate violet and white patterns that no artist could replicate. These weren't just flowers anymore in the eyes of the Dutch. They were masterpieces, one-of-a-kind creations that could never be exactly replicated through human effort. The infected bulbs became impossibly rare for a reason nobody understood at the time. The virus actually weakened the bulbs, making them less likely to produce offsets and more likely to die. The very thing that made them beautiful was slowly killing them from within. This created a perfect storm of scarcity that drove prices to astronomical levels. The most desirable tulips were the hardest to propagate and the most fragile. Supply remained tiny while demand exploded across all social classes. And demand was exploding everywhere, not just among the wealthy elite anymore. What started as a hobby for the rich began trickling down to the middle class with remarkable speed. Successful merchants, ship captains, skilled craftsmen, even weavers and carpenters. They all wanted in on the tulip trade. Tulips weren't just status symbols anymore. They had become investments, assets that seemed to only increase in value. People began noticing something interesting, something that changed their entire perspective on tulips. Every year, tulip prices went up, and not just a little bit either. A bulb that cost 10 guilders one year might sell for 15 the next, then 25, then 50, then 100. The mathematics were intoxicating. The potential profits seemed limitless. Here's where human psychology took over in ways that would repeat throughout economic history. When people see an asset consistently increasing in value, when they see their neighbors getting rich, when they hear stories of ordinary people making fortunes, something changes in their minds. They start to believe that the good times will last forever, that they've discovered a foolproof way to wealth. They start thinking that the old rules don't apply anymore, that this time is different. This is the beginning of every bubble in history, and the Dutch were experiencing it for the first time. They had no framework to understand what was happening, no historical precedent to warn them. The tulip trade began transforming in fundamental ways that would accelerate the mania. Initially, people bought and sold actual physical bulbs in straightforward transactions. You would inspect the bulb carefully, verify its quality and authenticity, hand over your money, and take possession. But tulips can only be safely dug up and transplanted during certain months of the year, typically during the summer dormancy period. For most of the year, the bulbs had to stay in the ground, growing and storing energy. This created a serious problem. How do you trade something you can't physically transfer for 8 or 9 months? The Dutch, being the innovative merchants they were, invented a solution that would change everything. They created a futures market for tulip bulbs, one of the earliest futures markets in history. Instead of trading the actual bulbs, they traded promissory notes, contracts that promised delivery of specific bulbs at specific future dates. You could buy a contract in November for a Semper Augustus bulb that wouldn't be dug up until the following June. This innovation was brilliant and disastrous in equal measure, a double-edged sword that cut deep. Suddenly, the tulip trade wasn't limited by physical bulbs anymore. It was limited only by how many contracts people were willing to write. And people were willing to write a lot of contracts, far more than there were actual bulbs. Traders began selling bulbs they didn't own, promising delivery of bulbs they hoped to acquire later. Buyers purchased contracts for bulbs they might never actually want, planning to flip the contracts for profit before delivery came due. The market divorced itself from reality, floating free from the constraints of actual supply and demand. The taverns of Amsterdam became the epicenters of the tulip trade. Smoky rooms filled with shouting men clutching contracts. These weren't the sophisticated stock exchanges we know today. They were rough establishments where deals were sealed with handshakes and ale. Ordinary citizens crowded into these taverns every evening, transforming neighborhood pubs into frenzied trading floors. Weavers stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants. Cobblers bargained with ship captains, and everyone believed they were about to get rich. The atmosphere was electric, intoxicating in ways that went beyond the alcohol being consumed. You could feel the energy, the desperation, the greed hanging in the air like smoke. Men who had never made a speculative investment in their lives were suddenly trading tulip contracts like seasoned finance. They developed their own slang, their own rituals, their own culture around the trade. The contracts themselves became increasingly complex and abstract, layered upon each other in dizzying arrangements. You could buy a contract for a bulb that didn't exist yet, an offset that hadn't been produced from a mother bulb that was itself promised in another contract. People were trading promises of promises, abstractions, built on abstractions. A house of cards reaching toward the sky, and nobody seemed to notice or care that the entire structure was built on air. Let me give you a sense of just how insane the prices became, how divorced from reality the market had grown. A single Semper Augustus bulb, the most prized variety, sold for 6,000 guilders at the peak of the mania. To put that in perspective, 6,000 guilders was enough to buy one of the grandest houses along Amsterdam's most prestigious canals. A skilled craftsman earned about 300 guilders per year, meaning the single bulb cost 20 years of wages. But it wasn't just the ultra-rare varieties commanding astronomical prices. Even common bulbs were selling for amounts that made no economic sense. Records show that people paid 1,000 guilders for a single viceroy bulb, 12 fat sheep for a single tulip bulb, for fat oxen. For another, one particularly detailed record lists an exchange where someone paid 4,400 guilders for a bulb, a price that included 4 oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, 2 barrels of wine, 4 barrels of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver drinking cup. Think about that transaction for a moment. Really let it sink in. Someone traded enough livestock to stock a farm, enough food to feed a family for a year, furniture, clothing, and silverware, all for a single tulip bulb. The madness had completely consumed rational thought, replacing it with pure speculation and greed. People weren't buying tulips because they loved flowers or wanted to display them in their gardens. They were buying tulips because they believed someone else would pay even more tomorrow. This is the greater fool theory in its purest form, and it was playing out across the Netherlands. Everyone was convinced they could sell to someone even more foolish than themselves. But what happens when you run out of fools? The social fabric of Dutch society began warping under the pressure of the tulip trade. Families fought over whether to invest in tulips. Marriages strained under the weight of risky speculative bets. Traditional relationships between classes broke down as servants suddenly had more money than their masters. The social hierarchy that had governed Dutch life for centuries was being appended by flower bulbs. Success stories spread like wildfire through the provinces, growing more exaggerated with each retelling. People heard about a chimney sweep who turned 10 guilders into thousands through smart tulip trading. A sailor who bought a bulb before a long voyage and returned to find his investment had multiplied tenfold. These stories, whether true or embellished, fueled the frenzy even more. Everyone wanted to be the next rags to riches success story, the next ordinary person who struck it rich. The psychological pull was irresistible to people who had spent their entire lives working hard for modest wages. Here was a shortcut to wealth that seemed guaranteed, a chance to escape the grinding poverty that defined most people's existence. Why work for years when you could get rich in months through tulip speculation? People began liquidating their actual assets to buy tulip contracts, selling things of real value to purchase promises. They sold their shops, their tools, their livestock, their land, converting tangible wealth into tulip futures. Some mortgaged their homes, taking on debt they couldn't afford to repay if the tulip market ever turned. Others borrowed from friends and family, pooling resources to make larger bets. The entire economy was being financialized, with more and more capital flowing into the tulip trade and away from productive activities. Fewer people were working their normal jobs, too distracted by tulip speculation to focus on their crafts. This should have been a warning sign, a flashing red light that the economy was becoming dangerously unbalanced. But people caught in a mania never see the warning signs until it's too late. Professional tulip traders emerged, men who did nothing but buy and sell contracts all day long. They developed sophisticated techniques, learning to manipulate prices and exploit less experienced traders. They would artificially inflate prices by making fake purchases, creating the illusion of demand to lure naive investors. Once prices rose, they would sell their holdings and move on to the next bulb. These traders were making fortunes, but they were also making enemies among those they exploited. Resentment grew as ordinary people realized they were being manipulated by professionals who understood the game better. The government watched all of this with growing concern but seemed paralyzed about what to do. The tulip trade existed in a legal gray area, neither fully regulated nor completely lawful. Officials debated whether tulip contracts were legally enforceable, whether they constituted real debt or just gentlemen's agreements. This uncertainty actually fueled more speculation because people believed they couldn't be held accountable. If the contracts weren't legally binding, what was the risk? You could make wild bets, knowing you might be able to walk away if things went wrong. Meanwhile, the actual tulip growers, the horticulturists who had started this whole thing with their beautiful gardens, watched in dismay. They had loved tulips for their beauty, not their speculative value, and they saw the trade destroying what they cherished. Real flower enthusiasts were being priced out of the market entirely, unable to afford bulbs for actual planting. The flowers themselves had become secondary to the financial instruments they represented. The peak of the mania came in the winter of 1636 to 1637, when prices reached their absolute zenith. Trading was happening at a fever pitch, with contracts changing hands multiple times per day. The most expensive bulbs were selling for amounts that exceeded annual government budgets of small towns. It was unsustainable, impossible to maintain. But momentum carried the market forward. Then, in early February 1637, something changed. Something subtle at first, but ultimately catastrophic. It started in Haarlem, a major center of the tulip trade, during a routine auction. A lot of expensive tulip bulbs came up for sale, and they failed to attract buyers at the expected prices. The auctioneer lowered the price, then lowered it again, and still no buyers materialized. For the first time in years, prices weren't going up. They were going down, and panic began to spread through the room like wildfire. If prices could fall today, they could fall tomorrow too. If they could fall tomorrow, maybe they would keep falling. And if they kept falling, everyone holding tulip contracts was about to lose everything. The psychology flipped instantly, from greed to fear, from euphoria to terror. The same herd mentality that had driven prices up now sent them plummeting down. Within days, the panic spread from Haarlem to Amsterdam, from Amsterdam to every corner of the Dutch Republic. Traders desperately tried to sell their contracts, but nobody wanted to buy anymore. The market for tulip futures completely collapsed, vanishing overnight, as if it had never existed. Contracts that had been worth thousands of guilders the previous week couldn't find buyers at any price. People frantically tried to unload their holdings, offering massive discounts, willing to take enormous losses just to get out. But there was nobody on the other side of the trade anymore. No buyers at all. The greater fool theory had reached its inevitable conclusion. There were no more fools left to sell to, and everyone realized simultaneously that they were holding worthless paper. The crash was total and absolute, one of the most complete market collapses in recorded history. Tulip bulbs that had sold for thousands of guilders were suddenly worth less than onions. Literally less than onions, because at least you could eat an onion. A tulip bulb was just a bulb, beautiful for a week or two each spring, but otherwise useless. The aftermath of the tulip crash was devastating, touching every level of Dutch society. Thousands of people woke up to discover they had lost everything. Their life savings evaporated in a matter of days. Men who had been wealthy merchants the previous week were now destitute, unable to pay their debts or feed their families. The social consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in a pond. Families were destroyed by the financial ruin. Marriages collapsed under the strain of bankruptcy. Children who had expected inheritances found themselves with nothing. Their parents' wealth converted into worthless tulip contracts. The streets of Amsterdam filled with desperate people, their faces showing the shock of sudden poverty. These weren't lazy or incompetent people. They were victims of their own greed and the herd mentality that had gripped the nation. The legal system was immediately overwhelmed with lawsuits and disputes over tulip contracts. Thousands of people had made promises they now couldn't keep, signed contracts they couldn't fulfill. Buyers who had agreed to pay enormous sums for tulips refused to honor their contracts now that the bulbs were worthless. Sellers who had promised delivery of specific bulbs tried to enforce their agreements, demanding payment. The courts faced an impossible question. Were these tulip contracts legally binding debts or merely speculative gambles? The answer would determine whether thousands of people faced debtor's prison or walked away unpunished. The Dutch government convened emergency sessions to address the crisis, debating how to handle the chaos. They faced a dilemma with no good solutions. Every option carried severe consequences. If they enforced all the contracts, thousands of people would be bankrupted and imprisoned, potentially destroying the social fabric of the nation. If they nullified the contracts, They would undermine the entire legal system and the concept of binding agreements. After much debate, the government chose a middle path that satisfied nobody but prevented total collapse. They declared that tulip contracts, made after November 1636, were not legally enforceable debts, but rather gambling agreements. This meant that buyers could walk away from their contracts by paying just 10% of the agreed price. It was a compromise designed to minimize the damage while maintaining some accountability. Sellers were furious, feeling cheated out of what they believed they were owed. Buyers were still angry about having to pay anything for worthless bulbs, even just 10%. But the decision prevented the complete collapse of Dutch society, allowing most people to recover eventually rather than facing total ruin. It was damage control, nothing more. The economic impact extended far beyond the tulip traders themselves, touching industries throughout the Dutch Republic. Businesses that had extended credit to tulip speculators now faced massive defaults. Banks that had made loans against tulip collateral saw their capital evaporate. The entire credit system seized up as trust disappeared, and lenders became terrified of making new loans. Economic activity slowed dramatically as people hoarded cash instead of investing or spending. Interestingly, historians have debated for centuries whether Tulip Mania was really as devastating as the stories suggest. Some modern scholars argue that the impact has been exaggerated over time, that the actual economic damage was relatively limited. They point out that most Dutch economic indicators remained strong after the crash, that the golden age continued for decades afterward. They suggest that the tulip trade was largely confined to the middle classes and didn't significantly impact the wealthy elite or the poor. But other historians counter that the psychological and social damage was real even if the economic statistics don't fully capture it. Thousands of families experience financial trauma that shaped their behavior for generations. The collective memory of Tulip Mania became seared into Dutch culture, a cautionary tale passed down through the centuries. It created a deep skepticism towards speculative bubbles that persists in Dutch financial culture to this day. The real significance of Tulip Mania is the economic damage it caused, but what it revealed about human nature and markets. It was the first time that mass speculation had been documented in detail, providing a template that would repeat throughout history. Every element that appeared in the tulip bubble has reappeared in subsequent manias. The initial rise in prices based on real scarcity, the creation of increasingly abstract financial instruments, the democratization of speculation to ordinary people, the belief that this time is different, the social contagion that spreads greed and fear like an epidemic, the professional manipulators who exploit naive investors, the government paralysis in the face of obvious danger, the sudden psychological flip from euphoria to panic. All of these patterns emerged during Tulip Mania and have repeated in the South Sea bubble, the railroad mania, the 1929 stock market crash, the dot-com bubble, the housing crisis, and cryptocurrency speculation. We keep making the same mistakes because the underlying psychology never changes. Humans are hardwired to follow the herd, to believe in get-rich-quick schemes, to think we're smarter than previous generations. We see our neighbors getting wealthy and feel compelled to join in, terrified of missing out. We rationalize obvious bubbles with sophisticated arguments about why the old rules don't apply anymore. We ignore warning signs because acknowledging them would mean admitting we've made a terrible mistake. The tulip traders of 1637 weren't stupid or uniquely irrational. They were normal people caught in extraordinary circumstances. They responded to incentives and social pressures in perfectly predictable ways, and we would likely do the same in their position. In fact, we have done the same, repeatedly, despite having their example to learn from. The technology changes, the asset being speculated on changes, but the fundamental dynamics remain identical. The lessons of Tulip Mania are uncomfortable because they reveal truths about ourselves that we prefer not to acknowledge. We like to think we're rational actors making informed decisions, but we're actually emotional creatures susceptible to manias and panics. We believe we can time the market, buying in early and selling before the crash. But statistics show that almost everyone fails at this. The people who get rich in bubbles are usually the ones who create them, not the ones who participate. So what should we take away from the story of Tulip Mania? First, be deeply skeptical when everyone around you is getting rich from a single type of investment, especially if that investment produces no income and depends entirely on finding someone willing to pay more. Second, recognize that extraordinary returns always come with extraordinary risks, and people only emphasize the former while downplaying the latter. Third, understand that markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, and timing a bubble's peak is essentially impossible. Fourth, never invest money you can't afford to lose, and never let speculation interfere with your ability to meet basic obligations. Fifth, remember that financial innovation often creates new ways to take old risks, and complexity usually serves to hide danger rather than eliminate it. The Dutch eventually recovered from Tulip Mania, and the Golden Age continued for several more decades. The tulip itself remained popular as an ornamental flower, prized for its beauty rather than its investment potential. Today, the Netherlands is still the world's largest tulip producer, exporting billions of bulbs annually at reasonable prices that anyone can afford. The flowers that once cost more than houses now sell for a few dollars. Their value returned to something approximating rationality. But the memory of Tulip Mania persists, a powerful reminder of what can happen when speculation replaces reason. It's a story that every generation needs to hear, especially those who believe they're too smart to fall for such obvious insanity. Because the truth is, we're all vulnerable to bubbles under the right circumstances. The question isn't whether you could fall for a modern Tulip Mania. The question is whether you'll recognize it when it's happening. And based on history, most of us won't. Not until it's far too late and the damage is done.